Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is a collection of frozen foods. Well, not everything's frozen. The pumpkin here is frozen, the potato peels are frozen, starting to thaw out a little bit. And over here, wrapped in some of these napkins, is some sort of like a cheesy bread, sort of a pastry. Wasn't so good, so it's getting fed to the worms. The system that is gonna, well, two systems that are gonna get that food are right in the background over here. They're in the black tubs. And there are a couple systems that have European night crawlers in them. The system on the left actually started out as worms being placed into some breeder bins. And that's why there's actually 3 stickers. One of the stickers is down there on the ground. It fell off. Today I'm going to put a replacement sticker on here with the same start date. A little bit larger text, easier to read. And that system, when we first started the breeder bins at least, it was 44 days ago, and then the breeder bins were all joined together, placed into that one tub. Later on we even added some more worms. The younger system is 20 days of age, and there we simply took worms, launched the new bin. Somewhat more conventional start to that system. It's been 10 days since we last fed these bins, so I'm going to get them up on the bench and give them some food. So let's get to work. If you look closely, you can see the word breed is on here, and 1, 2, 3, you're going to find traces of these 3 breeder buckets, I guess. I call them breeder bins, but they were buckets in reality. And for example, the 3 buckets each had one of these 1, 2, 3 newspapers covering the material inside, and then on top of that was one of these 1, 2, 3 pieces of cardboard. So I think in time we're eventually going to be able to make some sort of good use of the different bits and pieces of the old breeder bins, but until they get put to use in some way, I've just been sort of keeping them with the worms. And until we come up with a good idea on what to do with them, they'll just stick around nearby. All right, let's get this little wormy off the top surface. You can see all this moisture collecting here from those plastic coverings. The plastic really does a great job preventing any moisture from escaping the system. Well, I don't know if it's correct to say any moisture from escaping the system. At least whatever's under the plastic has a hard time escaping. I'm sure a little bit of moisture still seeps out around the edges. And man, we got a lot of paper in here. I'm even wondering if we might be able to set 1 or 2 of these pieces of paper aside, because even here you see another one. Perhaps we can sort of spread these resources out a little bit better and utilize those over in the next bin that we're going to check in on momentarily. So I think we'll do just that, because there's no real need for there to be so much stuff in here. There's even other stuff placed into here that was used to sort of isolate the finished castings from the horizontal migration feeding zone that I had set up to collect up the worms from their previous environment before they got relocated into here. So even these chunks of cardboard are a throwback to the, not even the breeder bins, but to even before that, to the previous system that these worms occupied. And let's see, I guess 10 days, I'm not sure what to expect as far as progress on the last feeding. I don't think the last feeding was frozen like today's feeding is. And to me it always seems like freezing the foods first enables them to break down a lot more quickly. Because like here, for example, I believe last time too, we fed potato peels. And this right here, I believe, is just a piece of potato peel, you know, just like what they're getting more of today. So you probably question, well, why, why even feed if there's still leftovers in here? And I think the main reason is I can even hear it snapping and crunching as I snap it in half as it breaks. Anything that hasn't been frozen, I'm fairly certain of it now that I can tell just from touching it that it hasn't been frozen. Anything that's not been frozen, I think is going to take a whole lot longer to break down. Because just the freezing and thawing of material seems to really jumpstart the the breakdown process. What the heck is this? I was wondering if something started growing in one of these or what that is. Interesting. So I figured whatever, we'll give these chunks of material that they got fed last time the time that it needs to deteriorate to the point where the worms can make use of it. But in the meantime, they're going to be fed some nice pumpkin and more potato peels, but potato peels that have been frozen and will benefit from that thawing process. The freezing and thawing process really does seem to, you know, you've probably handled stuff that's been frozen, and then after it thaws, it gets all mushy and gooey. Everything here that's still lingering around from the previous feeding 10 days ago has still got a pretty good crisp, you know, snap to it as it breaks, telling me that it's food that's going to take a little while before the worms can make use of it. And I'd rather keep them busy working on stuff that they can eat rather than, you know, have them surrounded by foods that they can't eat right away, at least. Here too, a piece of soup veggie, which if it had been frozen and thawed out, it would be a lot less crunchy and brittle than it is here. So those are going to sort of stick around as slow foods here too. Pretty good sized chunk of something, and still pretty tough in terms of holding up to the breakdown process. But whatever, we don't need to examine every single piece of food that was put in here last time, but you get the point, and you understand why I'm feeding, even though it doesn't seem necessary with all this leftovers in here. So in time, these leftovers will become such that the worms can make use of them, but we're not going to hold back on giving them a feeding today. So let's clear open a nice spot down here in the middle of the bin where we can drop in their portion for today. It is nice to see that there's a good number of castings starting to get developed in here. And you know, after 44 days, a little bit over a month now, it does seem like the worms have been busy breaking down the materials that they've been given. While they were in the breeder bins, they were fed, but I tried to feed them things that would be really easy to eat, all bite-sized stuff, like worm chow. I think I might have given them some coffee. And I figured I'd wait until they got released into a regular full-size bin before I start feeding them regular-sized kitchen scraps. So let's proceed with giving them some food. I guess we'll start with some of these napkins and paper towels here. That'll reveal that bread item that I want to include in today's feeding. Let's take a closer look at it. We'll save these other 2 or 3 napkins for the next system. And then here's a piece of paper towel. It's got a nice bacony smell to it. I used that piece of paper to dry a few pieces of bacon I made for breakfast yesterday. So here's some potato that I think is going to go a lot more quickly than the stuff that was put in here, more or less raw. And I don't know, freezing, thawing, I don't know if that still counts as raw since technically it was never cooked. But at least it was in some way processed or prepped for worm consumption. And to me, it just seems like a really easy prep method. Just allow it to freeze, because then just that thawing process will release a lot of the moisture within the system. Same thing goes with these chunks of pumpkin too. Here's some of this bread product, whatever it is. Alright, some sort of pastry. Sort of has like a layered, folded over kind of appearance to it. Spread that out and save part of it for the other system too. So I think we've got a fair split on the foods. Enough to go around to both systems here. Yeah, that seems like a pretty good feeding. Now I've got a little bit of grit we could sprinkle in. The grit that I use is pulverized eggshell. And the grit's just going to help the worms break down the foods that they're tasked with eating. And then the other thing I've got here is sort of like my worm chow, but it's not really. My worm chow is usually a mixture of a variety of different types of materials all blended together. But in this case, I was just curious to see what the material would look like if it was just one ingredient pulverized down as best as I can do. And in this case, it was birdseed. That's what birdseed looks like after it gets pulverized. And I like the way it, flows pretty loosely. I didn't know if it was going to have possibly a certain amount of like oil content, sunflower seed oil, whatever, Some of the seeds might have a certain amount of oily content to them. I didn't know how much was going to stick to itself once it gets ground up. But it's kind of nice to see that it flows pretty freely. So I've got my regular everyday worm chow off on the side, but I've been prioritizing the use of that stuff since I've got so much of it there. And then at some point I'll get back to feeding my everyday worm chow, which is more of a combination of different materials. So somehow I managed to blend in various chunks of leftovers, so they're all over the place. So those leftovers that I showed examples of earlier, they are kind of all over the place. I guess the last addition of worms was only 5 days ago, and at that time it was really just the addition of worms. But at that time I also used it as an opportunity to explore the system a little bit and see how things look. So I did till around within the system, and I did have a chance at that point to check out how some of these leftovers are coming along. And I think it was at that point I had already decided that those leftovers weren't really providing the worms with a whole lot of feeding opportunities since they had never been frozen. So it did seem to me like coming back into these systems with some stuff that the worms can more easily eat would be a smart idea. Alright, well, I just was curious to see how things look in here before we cover up. I figured we'd check out the outer edges, spin things around a little bit, till them up. And I don't know, I just have this thing where I always want to kind of cover up the foods, but now that a lot of it has been brought up to the surface, it seems like I could spend a bunch of time covering stuff up here, but I'm not going to bother. I think we're in good shape here. We'll start bringing back some of the materials that we found spread out across the top layers here. We'll bring back these cardboard bits. Some more stuff that the worms can play around in and nibble on. And then we can bring back a couple of these newspapers. I set a couple of them aside to leave them to be used in the other bin that we're going to check in on, because I peeked into there too, and there was a newspaper draped across the top there too, but there it looks like the worms have chewed the heck out of it. So it did seem like it might be a good idea to swap that out for them. Now here, I don't know, we had pretty good coverage with all that newspaper going edge to edge all the way around the entire container. Now that we've sort of reduced the number of coverings, I don't feel like I've got as good coverage. And that plastic covering that I'm using is just a couple of storage bags, which really aren't that big and don't go edge to edge either. So I feel like I would like to have some sort of edge to edge coverage since the plastic's not doing that. So I'm going to use these paper coverings to achieve that to some point in this system. And then maybe at some point I'll retire those storage bags and use some sort of other plastic coverings in here. But at some point it seemed like they were just what was handy, and I threw them on here. And they're doing a decent job, I can't complain. But it does seem like if we had better coverage, then more material would stay nice and damp out here on the surface. Not to say there's really any problem with allowing for some ventilation around the edges, but let's get the other bin out here and get them fed. Alright, so here in the 20-day-old, the younger of the two systems, I can really feel a pretty good difference in the weight here. It seems like there's a lot less stuff in here. I mean, visually it might look like there's a similar quantity of stuff. Perhaps there's just a lesser amount of moisture content to it. I can't explain why. but for whatever reason it does seem a little bit lighter. And then here's what I tried to explain earlier, is how this top covering of newspaper was really getting ravished by the worms here down the middle for whatever reason. So it seemed to me like we could just use this as supplemental bedding down in the feeding area, in addition to some of these napkins that they're getting, and then we'll be in good shape. So here it would have been, yeah, there we go, much of the same in terms of what types of food they got fed last time. This is just a chunk of vegetable, and same story as before. Here I didn't do any sort of disruption to the system like I did in the other bin where we added worms. Here this system has just been sitting around for the last 10 days since I last fed all this stuff, and this stuff just seems like it's going nowhere fast. So it's just a little lesson to be learned, I suppose, in terms of how to maximize the pace at which the worms could make use of the stuff you're giving them. If you really want to see the stuff start breaking down sooner, you might benefit from freezing it. And I suppose it depends on the types of foods that you're giving them, where it might make a difference and might not make a big difference. I would imagine foods like melon or pumpkin, even, whatever, a lot of those types of moisture rich foods, different types of fruits perhaps, might be such that the worms can really get down to chewing on them 1, 2, 3 pretty quickly. But all this stuff here, all this potato peel and all this other vegetable matter, it's just, I don't know, just sitting here going nowhere fast. And there's a good bit of it too. So it does seem a little bit counterintuitive to be coming in here with more food, but I really don't see them making much use of this food anytime soon. So let's keep them busy. Let's keep these hungry worms eating. So we're gonna open up a nice hole down here in the middle where we can drop in today's feeding. I don't know, somehow this system doesn't seem quite as big overall as the other bin. And like I said earlier, it just doesn't seem to have the weight either. Doesn't seem as heavy. So I'm wondering if, let's just go a little bit bigger here on the feeding zone. I think we're going to add some extra bedding besides those couple bits that I showed you a moment ago that are going in as bedding with the feeding. I mean, we can actually throw in some of it now. Throw in one of these napkins. Throw in some of this newspaper. We've even got more of it besides the food, but I think we're going to supplement this because I've got a good collection of prepared bedding. And the prepared bedding has also got some nice moisture content to it. It's a bunch of shredded paper and cardboard combined with some leaves. So I figured let's see what we could do about increasing the space for these worms in this system. Yeah, 2-3 handfuls seems like a nice foundation for today's feeding. Now I think we can start piling in some of this old food. And there's a bit of it here. Let's see if we can get the majority of it down into the hole so we can get it thoroughly covered up. Spread it around. You might have even noticed some of the bits. I can see little bits of the grit that was applied to this stuff when it was fed 10 days ago. So we can add a little bit more grit on top of the new foods, but these foods already had some grit applied to them. So it might be more beneficial to plop in the grit on top of the newly applied foods. Here's another paper towel, but I don't think this paper towel was used for bacon. This one was just used for sopping up some wet mess somewhere. These napkins came from the same place that I got this little wristband. I don't know if you're a regular on my channel, you'll notice that once in a while I just wear wristbands, and In this case, it was an event that I went to, and this just proves that I paid the admission, but it was, as you could tell, it was a holiday themed event. So I like to sometimes see how long I could make the wristbands from such occasions last before they just fall off. Sometimes they last quite a long time if I'm careful. Here's some more of that pastry, breadish sort of stuff. And the rest of the frozen foods. Pumpkin and potato. And pastry. So we've got a letter P themed feeding today. Alright. I think like I did before, in addition to the grit onto the foods, we can even sprinkle a little bit of this pulverized bird seed. I'm glad to see that this stuff is getting consumed pretty quickly. I've been adding it pretty liberally to most of my systems ever since I whipped up this stuff. So I think we can start coming back. If we spot any other large chunks of food floating out on the surface, we can return them down into the hole. Yeah, that's pretty good. Here we go, more potato from the previous feeding. Makes me wonder how long is it going to be before some of those food bits applied 10 days ago are actually going to start showing progress of breakdown. Could be a while. So let's do a nice thorough covering of the feeding area using some of these materials from a little bit further outboard within the system. This way we can just also verify that what's happening in the outskirts of the bin is okay. Things do look pretty good out here. At this point, I guess what I'm usually on the lookout for is any signs of the bin possibly losing its moisture, perhaps too rapidly, to evaporation. And, you know, after only 20 days, things look pretty nice in here. The worms are doing a pretty good job. Let's just see what we can do about tilling up this outer edge as well. Bring in some material from out there to cover up with. Oops. Although I think we've done a pretty decent job covering up the feeding area. And we've even done a pretty good job collecting up some of the foods from the previous feeding that were scattered about and getting them back down into the hole where the feedings are being applied. And we can level off. So yeah, that edge-to-edge plastic covering is doing a pretty good job. Didn't we see one of these in the other system? I don't know if that's just something that's growing in here. It sure looks that way to me. I wonder if it's potato. That would kind of make sense. I've heard a lot of people mention how if you put potato into your bins, it's going to start growing. That's just the way potatoes are, I suppose. And I don't see it that often, perhaps because I freeze. And, you know, perhaps just the process of the material freezing and thawing is enough to stunt its ability to try to grow eventually. But since that stuff was put in here raw, it might just be something we continue to see for a while in here. Interesting. Alright, so let's make sure we leave all this stuff in the bin rather than taking it to the sink and dumping it there. Let the worms have at it rather than just sending it down the drain. Alright, well, let's see. What do we got? We're almost done here. All we got to do is return the plastic covering, and one of these days I think I've got to find myself another similar sized plastic bag like this to cover up with in the other system too. I went looking around to see if I could find one, but I've probably got them all in use somewhere else. So my supply of these nice large plastic bags is a little bit limited right now. So either way, I do like these large bags because they do a good job covering edge to edge. Maybe some bubble wrap. I think I've got some bubble wrap somewhere too. I'll have to figure that out. So we're done here. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.